Hashtag WW2 Mysteries. Facts historians still can't explain. January 17th, 1940. Northern Poland. 3:42 a.m. The frost clung to everything. Barbed wire, rifle barrels, the breath of sentries standing watch over a captured Soviet supply depot. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter pressed his gloved fingers against the frozen metal of a strange canister his men had discovered buried beneath 3 feet of snow and canvas tarps. The label was in Cyrillic, unreadable to most of his unit, but the weight of the thing, nearly 40 kilograms, suggested something far more valuable than standard ammunition. In the darkness before dawn, with only kerosene lanterns casting their amber glow across the whiteness, Richter made a decision that would haunt military historians for the next 8 decades. He ordered the canister opened. What emerged was not explosives, not medicine, not even food in any recognizable form. Inside, packed in sawdust and protective cloth, were dozens of small glass vials containing a viscous amber liquid. Each vial bore a red star and a date, November 1939. The liquid caught the lamplight strangely, seeming to glow from within. Richter's company medic, a former pharmacist from Dresden, examined one vial carefully, held it to the light, and went pale. "Herr Oberleutnant," he whispered, "this should not exist." The temperature that morning was minus 23 degrees Celsius. By noon, Klaus Richter and 4 of his men would be dead, not from enemy fire, but from something the official Wehrmacht records would later describe only as unexplained physiological failure. The remaining vials vanished into the chaos of the early war, never to be catalogued, never to be explained. Their contents remain, to this day, unknown. The Second World War produced more than 60 million deaths, reshaped the political boundaries of the world, and generated enough documentation to fill entire libraries. Yet within this most thoroughly recorded conflict in human history exist gaps, deliberate omissions, impossible coincidences, and phenomena that defy rational explanation even after 80 years of investigation. These are not conspiracy theories or fringe speculation. These are documented events, witnessed by multiple credible observers, recorded in official military logs, and yet remaining fundamentally unexplained. They are the mysteries that serious historians acknowledge in footnotes and then move past, uncomfortable with their implications, unable to reconcile them with the established narrative of the war. This is the story of those mysteries, the documented impossibilities, the unexplained deaths, the phenomena that appeared once and never again, the coincidences so profound they seem to mock the very concept of chance. This is the story of what the war reports recorded but could never explain. The German advance through Poland in September 1939 was expected to be swift and brutal. What was not expected was the pattern of anomalies that began appearing in Wehrmacht after-action reports within the first 2 weeks of the invasion. On September 14th, an entire platoon of the 10th Panzer Division, 37 men with 6 armored vehicles, vanished while conducting a routine reconnaissance mission near the village of Krupski Mln. They maintained radio contact until 14:22 hours, reported no enemy contact, described clear weather and good visibility. Their final transmission was routine, proceeding south along Highway 12. No obstacles observed. Will report at checkpoint in 15 minutes. They never reached the checkpoint. They never transmitted again. Within 2 hours, search parties were dispatched. They found the vehicles abandoned on the highway, engines still running, fuel tanks 3/4 full. Personal effects remained in the trucks, letters half-written, cigarettes still burning in ashtrays, a pocket watch that had stopped at exactly 14:23. The men themselves were simply gone. No bodies were ever recovered. No witnesses ever came forward. The official report, filed by Major General Ferdinand Schall, described the incident as unexplained disappearance under circumstances defying tactical analysis. The report was classified and buried in Wehrmacht archives for 43 years. This was not an isolated incident. Between September 1939 and June 1941, German military records document 17 separate cases of unit disappearances on the Eastern Front, cases where entire squads, platoons, or specialized teams vanished without trace, without rational explanation, in areas with no significant enemy presence. The pattern was consistent and disturbing: routine operations, sudden loss of contact, abandoned equipment found in perfect working order, and no bodies ever recovered. Wehrmacht intelligence initially suspected Soviet special operations, but as the pattern continued and intensified after Operation Barbarossa began, that explanation grew less tenable. Soviet units reported similar phenomena. NKVD files declassified in 1997 reference at least 9 cases of spontaneous unit dissolution between 1941 and 1943, Soviet soldiers disappearing under circumstances their commanders could not explain or even adequately describe. But the disappearances, while disturbing, were not the only anomalies. Something stranger was happening in the winter of 1941, during the desperate German assault on Moscow. December 5, 1941. Krasnaya Polyana, 22 kilometers from the Kremlin. The temperature was minus 38 degrees Celsius. General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center had ground to a frozen halt, its men suffering from frostbite, starvation, and the crushing realization that Moscow would not fall. In this landscape of despair, soldiers on both sides began reporting something that military psychiatrists initially dismissed as cold-induced hallucination: lights in the sky that moved with apparent purpose, that responded to ground activity, that seemed to observe the carnage below with what witnesses described as deliberate attention. The reports came from German and Soviet sources independently. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, commanding a Soviet anti-aircraft battery near Khimki, filed a report on December 7 describing 3 luminous objects, pale blue in color, spherical, approximately 10 meters in diameter, hovering at an altitude of roughly 800 meters for a period of 47 minutes. Volkov ordered his battery to open fire. The objects did not react to the shells, did not maneuver to evade, simply remained stationary as the artillery rounds passed harmlessly through them or around them. The reports were inconsistent on this detail. After 47 minutes, the objects accelerated upward at a speed Volkov estimated at not less than 2,000 kilometers per hour and vanished into the overcast sky. On the German side, similar reports emerged from the 2nd Panzer Army. Hauptmann Joseph Schultz documented aerial phenomena of unknown origin, exhibiting flight characteristics inconsistent with any known aircraft, observed nightly between December 4th and December 11th, 1941. What makes these reports significant is not the sightings themselves. War zones produce many strange visual phenomena, but what happened next? Every unit that filed official reports about these lights experienced catastrophic casualties within 72 hours. Volkov's battery was overrun on December 9th. He and 3 survivors were the only men to escape. Schultz's company was decimated by a Soviet counterattack on December 12th. Schultz himself was killed. The pattern repeated across 7 documented cases. Units that reported the lights died. Units that did not survived at statistically normal rates. Soviet military analysts noted the correlation, but could offer no explanation. The final Stavka intelligence assessment, dated March 1942, concluded only that atmospheric phenomena in the Moscow operational area during December 1941 correlate with subsequent unit casualties at a confidence level exceeding 94%. Causation remains undetermined. The lights were never satisfactorily explained. They appeared in no German or Soviet aircraft recognition manuals. They matched no known weather phenomenon. And they vanished entirely after December 1941, never to reappear in European skies for the duration of the war. But the European theater was not the only source of mysteries. In the Pacific, Japanese forces encountered phenomena that their meticulous military bureaucracy recorded but could never comprehend. April 3, 1942. The Philippine Sea, 40 nautical miles east of Samar Island. The heavy cruiser Notori was conducting anti-submarine operations when her sonar operator detected something that should not have existed. The contact was massive, larger than any submarine in any Navy's inventory, moving at a depth of 680 meters and maintaining a steady speed of 43 knots. For context, the fastest submarine of World War II, the German Type XXI U-boat, could manage 17 knots submerged. No submarine in 1942 could dive below 200 meters safely, and none could sustain high speed at depth. Yet the notorious Sonar tracked this impossible contact for 41 minutes. Captain Katsumi Yamada ordered his ship to pursuit. The cruiser's maximum speed of 35 knots was insufficient. The contact maintained its course and speed effortlessly, seeming to toy with its pursuer. Then, at 10:47 hours, it dove. The sonar operator watched the contact descend past the theoretical crush depth of any submarine, past 800 meters, past 1,000, past 1,200. At 1,340 meters, the sonar lost contact. The notorious war diary records the incident in clinical detail. Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence analyzed the report and concluded it represented a phenomenon beyond current understanding of underwater propulsion and hull engineering. No explanation was ever provided. No similar contact was ever recorded again. 3 months later, during the Battle of Midway, American pilots reported something equally inexplicable. Ensign Frank O'Flaherty, flying a Douglas SPD Dauntless from the USS Enterprise, was pursuing a damaged Japanese bomber on the afternoon of June 4, 1942, when both aircraft entered a dense cloud bank at 3,200 meters altitude. O'Flaherty's after-action report describes what happened next with the careful precision of a man who knew he would not be believed. At 16:14, while in cloud, my aircraft experienced sudden and complete electrical failure. Radio dead, instruments dead. Engine continued running, but throttle control became unresponsive. Emerged from cloud at 16:16. Japanese aircraft had vanished. My position was approximately 340 nautical miles from my last known location, having somehow traveled this distance in under 2 minutes. Fuel consumption consistent with only 2 minutes of flight, not the hours required to cover such distance by conventional means. O'Flaherty was an experienced pilot with 847 flight hours and a reputation for meticulous navigation. His account was corroborated by his fuel state, which matched his claim exactly, and by the Enterprise's radar plot, which showed his aircraft disappear from one location and reappear in another almost instantaneously. Navy investigators interviewed O'Flaherty for 6 hours. They examined his aircraft systems. They found no evidence of instrument malfunction, no sign of navigational error. The final investigation report, filed in August 1942 and classified until 1993, concluded that Ensign O'Flaherty's account, while extraordinary, is supported by sufficient physical evidence to warrant acceptance as factual. No conventional explanation can account for the described translocation. This was not the only incident of its kind. Between June 1942 and August 1945, American and Japanese aviators filed 19 separate reports of instantaneous translocation, aircraft disappearing from one location and reappearing in another with no elapsed subjective time and minimal fuel consumption. The reports came from both sides. They came from veteran pilots and novices. They came from single-engine fighters and multi-engine bombers. And they defied every principle of physics and aeronautics that the combatants possessed. Yet perhaps no mystery of the Pacific War is more disturbing than the incident at Rabaul in February 1943. The Japanese naval base at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, was one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific, home to nearly 100,000 troops, defended by extensive anti-aircraft batteries and protected by rugged jungle terrain. On February 19, 1943, Allied intelligence received reports from Coast Watcher networks that something unprecedented had occurred at the base. According to multiple independent sources, Australian Coast Watchers, native islanders who served as Allied scouts and later captured Japanese prisoners, a section of the base's northern perimeter, an area of approximately 4 hectares including barracks, ammunition storage, and defensive positions, had vanished overnight. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Vanished. Witnesses described the boundary of the affected area as precise and geometric, a perfectly circular zone within which everything had simply ceased to exist. The Earth itself was gone, replaced by a smooth, glassy surface that reflected light with mirror-like precision. Japanese engineers who examined the site reported temperatures at the surface exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, heat with no apparent source that persisted for 72 hours before gradually dissipating. The official Japanese military investigation, conducted by engineers from the Imperial Japanese Navy's technical branch, concluded that the affected area had been subjected to thermal energy of unknown origin exceeding any conventional explosive yield by a factor of at least 100. Nearly 1,200 men had been stationed in the affected area. No bodies were recovered. No remains were found. The glassy surface, when later analyzed by Allied engineers after Rabaul's capture in 1944, showed fusion patterns consistent with exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, temperatures that in 1943 could only be produced in specialized industrial furnaces and certainly not instantaneously over 4 hectares of jungle. What happened at Rabaul? The Japanese never offered a public explanation. Allied intelligence initially suspected some kind of catastrophic ammunition explosion, but the physics didn't match. Chemical explosives produce blast effects, fragmentation, and cratering. The Rabaul site showed none of these. It showed only heat, applied with impossible intensity and inexplicable precision. General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence staff studied the reports and photographs extensively. Their classified assessment, filed in May 1943, made no attempt to explain the phenomenon, noting only that the described effects are inconsistent with any known weapon system or natural phenomenon. The file was marked unexplained and buried in Pacific Theater archives for 52 years. But the Pacific and European theaters, for all their mysteries, could not compare to the strange phenomena that emerged in the final year of the war, as the Third Reich collapsed and its secret projects came to light. March 9, 1945. Ohrdruf, Germany. American forces of the 4th Armored Division liberated a small concentration camp that would later become famous as the first such camp discovered by Western Allied forces. But Ohrdruf was more than a camp. Beneath the surface facility, German engineers had constructed an extensive underground complex, laboratories, workshops, testing chambers that extended 3 levels below ground. When American engineers first explored these subterranean levels, they found evidence of research programs that made no sense, experiments that seemed to violate basic principles of physics and chemistry, apparatus whose purpose could not be determined, and records describing results that should have been impossible. In Laboratory 7, on the 3rd sublevel, engineers discovered a chamber lined with a strange metallic alloy that analysis would later reveal to be a titanium-tungsten composite that should not have been producible with 1945 metallurgy. The chamber was perfectly spherical, 8 meters in diameter, with no visible seams or entry points, yet the Americans had clearly entered it through a doorway. Careful examination revealed the doorway had been cut through the sphere's wall after the chamber's construction, suggesting the sphere had somehow been fabricated as a single seamless piece. Inside the sphere, mounted at precise geometric intervals, were devices that looked like nothing in the Allied technical intelligence catalogs, crystalline structures suspended in magnetic fields, generating a low-frequency hum that could be felt in the bones of anyone who entered the chamber. The documents found at Ohrdruf, fragmentary and partly destroyed by fleeing SS personnel, referred to this apparatus as Die Glocke, the bell. The project leader, SS Obergruppenführer Jacob Spornberg, had escaped before American arrival, but junior scientists captured at the site provided testimony that was consistent, disturbing, and inexplicable. They described experiments involving the bell that had produced effects they called temporal displacement. Objects placed within the chamber's field reportedly aged years and seconds, or alternatively, emerged showing no signs of elapsed time despite hours of exposure. Test animals placed in the field exhibited cellular decay patterns. Their cells showed characteristics of having experienced years of life in minutes of exposure. 5 of the German scientists working on the Bell project died during the research. Their deaths were officially attributed to exposure to unknown radiation, but medical records preserved at the site showed something stranger. The dead scientists' bodies showed no radiation burns, no cellular damage consistent with known radiation types. Instead, their tissues had simply stopped functioning, Hearts that ceased beating with no pathological cause, lungs that stopped processing oxygen despite being structurally intact. It was as if their bodies had simply forgotten how to be alive. The bell itself disappeared. American technical intelligence teams that arrived at Ohrdruf on March 13th, 4 days after liberation, found the apparatus gone, removed with such care that the mounting point showed no sign of hasty dismantling. The crystalline components, the magnetic containment systems, the control mechanisms, all vanished. What remained were only the documents, incomplete and cryptic, and the testimony of scientists who insisted they had witnessed something that should not exist. The official U.S. Army report on Ohrdruf, filed by the Technical Intelligence Team in April 1945, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic caution. It describes the underground facility in detail, catalogs the equipment found, and then addresses the bell with a single paragraph. Recovered documents reference experimental apparatus of undetermined purpose designated die Glocke. Physical evidence suggests high-energy physics experimentation beyond the scope of known German research capabilities. Apparatus not recovered. Recommend further investigation if additional evidence emerges. No further investigation was ever conducted, at least not in any documented form. The bell, if it truly existed and functioned as described, vanished into the chaos of the collapsing Reich. But perhaps the most profound mystery of the war emerged not from secret Nazi research, but from the ordinary experience of combat soldiers, a mystery so widespread, so consistently reported, and so thoroughly inexplicable that it became known simply as the phenomenon. It began with isolated reports in late 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and Japan faced inevitable defeat. Soldiers on both sides, German, Japanese, American, British, Soviet, began reporting moments of impossible clarity, brief episodes during combat where time seemed to slow, where they possessed knowledge they could not have obtained, where they made decisions based on information that did not yet exist. Private James Hendricks, 2nd Infantry Division, described such a moment during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. His squad was advancing through dense forest near Rochrath when Hendricks suddenly stopped, raised his hand, and ordered his men to take cover behind a nearby berm. They obeyed without question. Hendricks was a veteran, trusted by his unit. 15 seconds later, German artillery opened fire on the exact position where the squad would have been if they had continued their advance. Hendricks saved 7 lives. When questioned later about how he knew the artillery was coming, Hendricks could only say, "I saw it happen. I saw the shells falling, saw Williams, Private Williams, saw him get hit. Then I realized it hadn't happened yet. So I stopped us." Private Williams, who would have been killed by the artillery barrage, corroborated Hendricks' account. So did 5 other squad members. They all reported that Hendricks had shown no sign of hesitation, had not paused to listen or scan the area, had simply stopped and taken cover as if responding to an attack that had not yet occurred. When pressed to explain his certainty, Hendricks became distressed. "I remember it," he insisted. "I remember Williams dying. I remember the shell impacts. I remember all of it. But it didn't happen because I stopped us. How can I remember something that didn't happen?" This was not an isolated case. Between December 1944 and May 1945, Allied military psychiatrists documented more than 400 cases of what they termed precognitive combat response, soldiers who reported knowledge of future events, who made decisions based on memories of outcomes that had not yet occurred, who described seeing alternate timelines where their actions led to different results. The reports came from all combat branches: infantry, armor, artillery, aviation. They came from officers and enlisted men. They came from veterans and replacements fresh from training. And they shared common features. The experiences always occurred during moments of extreme stress, always involved life-or-death decisions, and always left the subjects disturbed and unable to adequately explain what they had experienced. Japanese soldiers reported similar phenomena. Sergeant Takashi Yamamoto, captured on Okinawa in June 1945, described an incident during the defense of Shuri Castle, where he ordered his machine gun team to relocate from their position despite having no tactical reason to do so. Minutes later, American naval gunfire obliterated their former position. When American interrogators asked how he knew to move, Yamamoto responded through an interpreter, "I had already died there. I remembered dying. So I moved my men so it would not happen." The interrogator noted that Yamamoto showed signs of significant psychological distress when discussing the incident and requested to discontinue the interview. Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front reported what they called ghost memories, recollections of battles that had not yet been fought, knowledge of enemy positions before reconnaissance had revealed them, premonitions of death that came true if unheeded and were avoided if acted upon. NKVD counterintelligence initially suspected these reports indicated enemy infiltration or compromised communications security. But the pattern was too widespread, too consistent, and too clearly associated with combat stress to represent any kind of intelligence operation. By March 1945, Soviet military psychiatrists had documented more than 800 cases. Their classified report to Stavka, declassified in 2001, concluded that combat personnel exposed to extreme stress demonstrate anomalous cognitive phenomena inconsistent with current understanding of human perception and memory formation. The Western Allies' approach to these reports evolved as their frequency increased. Initial cases were dismissed as combat fatigue, hallucination, or fortunate instinct. But as more reports accumulated, as more soldiers described impossible knowledge that nonetheless proved accurate, military psychiatrists began to take the phenomenon seriously. In January 1945, the U.S. Army's Medical Corps established a classified research program designated Project Foresight to study precognitive combat experiences. The project operated for 4 months, interviewed 127 soldiers who reported such experiences, and produced a final report in May 1945 that remains partially classified to this day. The unclassified portions of the Foresight report are remarkable for their candor. The researchers acknowledged they could offer no conventional explanation for the reported phenomena. They confirmed that in every case they could verify, soldiers who acted on precognitive information indeed avoided casualties that their memories had predicted. They noted that subjects showed consistent patterns of distress when discussing their experiences, suggesting genuine trauma rather than fabrication. And they concluded, cautiously but unmistakably, that the documented cases present significant evidence for human cognitive capabilities beyond current scientific understanding, particularly as manifested under conditions of extreme physiological and psychological stress. Project Foresight was terminated in June 1945, not because it had completed its mission, but because the war was ending and military priorities were shifting. Its files were classified and archived. The researchers were dispersed to other assignments. The soldiers who had reported precognitive experiences returned to civilian life, most of them never speaking publicly about what they had experienced, knowing they would not be believed. The mysteries did not end with the war's conclusion. In some ways, they intensified. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. 8:15 a.m. local time. The atomic bomb designated Little Boy detonated at an altitude of 580 meters above the city, unleashing destruction beyond any previous human experience. In the immediate aftermath, as survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened, reports began emerging of phenomena that could not be explained by nuclear physics or blast mechanics. Multiple survivors, interviewed in the weeks and months after the bombing, described seeing what they called shadow people, human figures that appeared in the ruins, moving through areas of lethal radiation exposure, seemingly unaffected by the heat, the flames, or the contamination that killed anyone else who entered those zones. These figures were reported to assist injured survivors, pulling them from collapsed buildings, guiding them towards safer areas, providing water from sources that should have been contaminated. And then, according to every witness account, the figures would vanish, not walk away, not leave through any visible exit, but simply cease to exist, fading from visibility like morning fog in sunlight. Dr. Fumio Shigeto, one of the few physicians in Hiroshima who survived the bombing and retained medical capability, documented several encounters with these shadow people during his desperate attempts to treat the injured. His journal, preserved in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, describes his confusion and frustration. August 7, 1945. While treating burn victims near the AIY Bridge, I was assisted by a man I did not recognize, approximately 30 years old, wearing what appeared to be work clothing, apparently uninjured. He helped me move 3 victims to shelter, displayed knowledge of basic medical procedures, and spoke with a modern accent. When I turned to thank him, he was gone. I searched the area. No one matching his description was present. 3 other survivors confirmed seeing him. None could explain his disappearance. Similar reports came from Nagasaki after the second atomic bombing on August 9th. The shadow people appeared again, always in areas of most severe destruction, always assisting survivors, always vanishing before they could be questioned or identified. Japanese investigators who studied these reports noted that the descriptions of the shadow people were remarkably consistent across unrelated witnesses. Their apparent age, their clothing, their behavior all matched despite the witnesses having no contact with each other. The reports were eventually attributed to trauma-induced hallucination, shared psychological response to unprecedented catastrophe. But this explanation satisfied no one who examined the evidence carefully. Hallucinations do not move debris. Hallucinations do not provide water. Hallucinations do not leave physical evidence of their presence, and in at least 4 documented cases, the shadow people left such evidence: footprints in ash, disturbed rubble patterns, and in one case, a piece of cloth that a survivor claimed was torn from a shadow person's clothing during a rescue. The cloth was analyzed by Japanese researchers. It was cotton of a weave pattern not manufactured in Japan, bearing no radiation contamination despite being found in a zone where contamination levels were lethal. The shadow people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were never identified. No credible theory has ever explained their origin, their apparent immunity to radiation, or their vanishing. They remain a footnote in atomic bombing histories, acknowledged by historians but left unexplained, too strange to integrate into the standard narrative of August 1945. As the war ended and the world began its long process of recovery and reckoning, the mysteries remained. Archivists and historians working through captured German documents discovered references to experiments and projects that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than historical record. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit German scientists, brought men to the United States who spoke carefully, when they spoke at all, about research that had pushed beyond the boundaries of accepted science. Soviet forces, occupying Eastern Germany, found similar evidence and extracted similar scientists who would work in secrecy for decades. In Japan, American occupation forces discovered records of Unit 731's experiments in biological warfare, horrific human experimentation that produced mountains of documentation. But buried within those documents were references to other programs, smaller and less thoroughly documented, that studied phenomena the Japanese researchers called consciousness alteration effects and non-local perception enhancement. These programs reportedly produced results that terrified even the hardened war criminals who conducted them, results suggesting that human consciousness was far stranger, far more malleable, and far more powerful than anyone had suspected. These documents were classified immediately. Some remained classified for decades. Some remain classified still. The few researchers who have gained access to the unredacted files speak of discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality, about time, about the nature of consciousness itself. But they speak carefully, constrained by classification restrictions and by the knowledge that their claims will sound absurd to anyone who has not seen the evidence. The summer of 1946. Allied military archives began the massive process of cataloging and storing war records. Among those records were thousands of reports that clerks and archivists flagged as unexplained phenomena, incidents that fit no standard category, that suggested possibilities the official histories could not accommodate. These reports were gathered, cross-referenced, and sealed in classified storage. They remain there still, in archives in Washington, London, and Moscow, accessible only to researchers with appropriate clearances and compelling justifications. In 1952, a joint American-British research team designated Project Blackout was established to study the wartime disappearances, the 17 documented German cases, the 9 Soviet cases, and now, as more records became available, 14 American cases, and 6 British cases where military units had simply vanished under circumstances that defied explanation. The project operated for 3 years, reviewed thousands of pages of evidence, interviewed surviving witnesses, and produced a classified final report in 1955. The conclusions, according to researchers who have seen the unredacted document, were disturbing. The disappearances showed patterns suggesting they were not random, that they occurred in geographic clusters that corresponded to no known tactical or strategic factors, and that in several cases, disappeared units had been conducting operations related to unusual signal intelligence or investigating other anomalous phenomena when they vanished. Project Blackout recommended continued study and monitoring. Instead, it was terminated in 1956, its files classified at the highest levels, its research team dispersed, and its findings buried. No explanation for this termination has ever been provided. The decades passed. Veterans aged and died, taking their strange experiences with them. The official histories of the war solidified, became canon, were taught to generations of students. The mysteries were forgotten by all but a few specialists, historians who noted the gaps in their footnotes, veterans who never quite believed their own memories, archivists who sometimes paused while filing certain documents and wondered what, exactly, had happened during those 6 years of global conflict. In 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, thousands of previously classified Soviet military documents became accessible to Western researchers. Among them were files from the NKVD's wartime investigations into anomalous phenomena, the lights over Moscow, the ghost memories of combat soldiers, and something else, something the Soviets had called chronological displacement events. These events, according to the files, were moments when causality itself seemed to break down, when effects preceded causes, when the sequence of events became tangled and contradictory. Soviet physicists had studied these reports, trying to reconcile them with Marxist materialism and with conventional physics. They failed. Their final assessment, written in 1947 and classified until 1991, concluded that phenomena observed during the Great Patriotic War suggest physical principles not currently understood by science. Further study required if theoretical framework can be developed to allow rational investigation. That theoretical framework was never developed, at least not publicly. The Soviet files went back into storage, now in Russian archives rather than Soviet ones, still classified, still inaccessible except to the most persistent researchers. In 2003, the British Ministry of Defence declassified portions of its World War II intelligence files under pressure from historical researchers and Freedom of Information Act requests. Among the released documents were reports from the Royal Air Force's Intelligence Branch regarding anomalous aerial phenomena observed over Europe between 1943 and 1945. These phenomena, lights in the sky that moved with apparent intelligence, that avoided anti-aircraft fire, that seemed to observe military operations, were documented in hundreds of pilot reports and ground observer accounts. The RAF had investigated thoroughly, suspecting German secret weapons. They found no evidence of any such weapons. The lights' behavior was consistent across all reports. They appeared near areas of heavy combat, they exhibited flight characteristics impossible for any aircraft of the era, and they never attacked or interfered with operations despite ample opportunity to do so. They simply watched. The declassified files included a memo from Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, dated November 1943, responding to a request for his assessment of the phenomena. Dowding, who had commanded Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain and whose competence was beyond question, wrote, "I have reviewed the reports with considerable care. The described phenomena are real, not hallucination or misidentification. They represent either technology far in advance of current capabilities or phenomena beyond current scientific understanding. I can offer no conventional explanation. Recommend continued observation and documentation until sufficient data accumulates to allow theoretical analysis." That analysis was never completed. Or, if it was, it remains classified. What are we to make of these mysteries? What do they tell us about the war, about history, about the nature of reality itself? The easy answer is to dismiss them, to attribute them to stress, to misidentification, to the fog of war and the unreliability of human observation under extreme conditions. But this dismissal requires us to ignore certain facts. It requires us to ignore that the reports come from multiple independent sources, from trained military observers, from men who had every incentive to report accurately and every understanding of the importance of credible intelligence. It requires us to ignore that many of these incidents were investigated thoroughly by military authorities who had access to all the evidence and who nonetheless could provide no explanation. It requires us to ignore the documented physical evidence, the glassy surface at Rabaul, the cloth from Hiroshima, the abandoned equipment from the disappeared units, that cannot be dismissed as psychological phenomenon. The difficult answer is to acknowledge that the war contained experiences and events that do not fit our established understanding. This acknowledgement does not require belief in the supernatural or the paranormal. It requires only intellectual honesty about the limits of our knowledge and the recognition that a conflict involving millions of people spread across the entire globe, operating under conditions of extreme stress and pushing the boundaries of technology and human endurance, might have produced phenomena that our current theories cannot accommodate. Consider what the soldiers experienced on all sides in all theaters. Consider the German soldiers who witnessed their comrades vanish without trace. Consider the Soviet defenders who saw lights in the sky as their world collapsed in frozen hell outside Moscow. Consider the American sailors who tracked contacts that should not exist. Consider the aviators who found themselves displaced across hundreds of miles in instants. Consider the combat soldiers who remembered futures that had not yet happened and changed their actions to avoid deaths they had already experienced in some other version of events. Consider the survivors of Hiroshima who were pulled from rubble by helpers who could not be found or identified. These were not credulous civilians or sensation-seeking journalists. These were military personnel, trained observers, men and women who understood the importance of accurate reporting and who knew the consequences of filing false information. They reported what they experienced, knowing in many cases that they would not be believed, that their reports would be buried, that their experiences would be dismissed or explained away. Yet the reports persist. The documentation endures. And the mysteries remain, acknowledged in footnotes, filed in classified archives, known to specialists but absent from the standard histories that shape our understanding of the war. The war ended in 1945, but its mysteries did not. They continued to influence events, to shape research programs, to haunt the men who had witnessed phenomena they could not explain. In the decades after the war, as veterans gathered at reunions and memorials, quiet conversations sometimes occurred, whispered exchanges where old soldiers shared experiences they had never spoken of publicly, comparing notes, seeking validation, trying to understand what had happened to them. These conversations were never recorded officially. They survive only in the memories of participants and occasionally in private letters or diaries. But they suggest that the unexplained experiences of the war were far more common than official records indicate, that for every incident documented in military files there were dozens more that went unreported, that the mysteries we know about represent only a fraction of the mysteries that occurred. Why were so many incidents left unreported? The reasons are human and understandable. Soldiers feared ridicule, feared being labeled as psychologically damaged, feared that reporting impossible experiences would end their careers or result in psychiatric evaluation. Better to stay silent, to file conventional reports, to keep the impossible experiences private and unexplained. But silence does not erase truth. It only hides it. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. Aboard the USS Missouri, representatives of the Empire of Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender, formally ending World War II. As the ceremony concluded, as the representatives departed and the ship's company secured from general quarters, a young Navy photographer named James Fahey stood at the rail, looking out at the assembled fleet, thinking about the war and what it had meant. Fahey had served throughout the Pacific Campaign. He had photographed combat, had documented victories and losses, had seen things that would stay with him for the rest of his life. In his diary that night, he wrote an entry that would be published decades later in his memoir. Today the war ended, and I find myself unable to feel the relief I expected. Too much happened that I do not understand. Too much that makes no sense. I keep thinking of the men who vanished, the things we saw that should not exist, the moments when reality seemed to bend. We won the war, but I am not sure we understood it. Fahi's uncertainty speaks to something profound. The Second World War was the most documented conflict in human history, fought by literate, educated combatants who kept records, filed reports, and preserved evidence with unprecedented thoroughness. Yet within all that documentation exist gaps and impossibilities, incidents recorded but unexplained, phenomena witnessed but never understood. These mysteries do not diminish the war's historical importance or the sacrifices made by those who fought it. They do not change the fundamental narrative of Axis aggression and Allied victory. But they add depth and strangeness to that narrative. They remind us that human experience is richer and more complex than our theories allow, that reality contains possibilities we have not yet learned to recognize or explain. The soldiers who reported impossible knowledge of future events were not lying. The sailors who tracked impossible contacts were not hallucinating. The survivors who were rescued by people who could not be found were not fabricating their experiences. Something happened, something real, something documented, something that defies our current understanding. What that something was, we still do not know. 80 years after the war's end, the mysteries remain mysteries. The files stay classified. The explanations elude us. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it is appropriate that the war that changed everything, that reshaped the world and killed millions, should contain within it elements that resist understanding, phenomena that remind us that for all our knowledge and all our documentation, there remain experiences at the edges of human comprehension that we can record but not explain. The last veteran of World War II will die someday, perhaps has already died by the time you read this. When that happens, the living memory of the war will end. What will remain are documents, photographs, films, and mysteries. The mysteries will outlast the memories. They will persist in archives, waiting for researchers who might one day have the theoretical tools to understand them, or at least to ask better questions about them. Until then, we are left with the records. We are left with Klaus Richter and his mysterious vials. We are left with the vanished platoons and the lights over Moscow. We are left with impossible sonar contacts and displaced aircraft. We are left with the glassy crater at Rabaul and the shadow people of Hiroshima. We are left with soldiers who remembered futures that did not happen and changed their actions to make those memories into lies. We are left with the undeniable evidence that during 6 years of global conflict, as millions fought and died to determine the fate of civilization, other things were happening, strange things, impossible things, things that suggest reality is more malleable and more mysterious than we have acknowledged. These are the facts that historians cannot explain. Not because the facts are false, but because we do not yet have the framework to understand them. The war produced them, recorded them, and then moved on, leaving them behind as puzzles for future generations. The mysteries wait, patient and silent, in the archives. They wait for the questions we have not yet learned to ask, for the theories we have not yet developed, for the understanding we do not yet possess. They wait as they have waited for 80 years, documented but unexplained, witnessed but not understood, real but impossible. And they will continue to wait, these facts that historians still cannot explain, until history catches up with them, or until they force history to expand its conception of what facts can be. The war ended. The mysteries endured. And somewhere, in a classified file or a forgotten archive, lies the evidence that might one day help us understand what really happened during those 6 years when the world went mad and reality itself seemed to fracture at the edges, producing phenomena that should not exist but indisputably did. Until that day comes, we can only document, wonder, and acknowledge the truth that veterans like James Fahy understood. We won the war, but we did not understand it. Perhaps we still do not. Perhaps we never will. The mysteries remain. And they are waiting.